Every town has its landmark. In Millage, it wasn't a statue or a city sign. It was the man in the corner booth at Maple and Pine. The diner's bell gave a soft, familiar ring as Siobhan stepped inside, his tall frame slightly stooped, his steps slow but deliberate. The warmth of maple syrup, eggs, and a well-worn griddle wrapped around him like an old friend. He didn't need to look, his booth, the one by the window with a perfect view of the intersection, was always empty at exactly 6:42 a.m. Darlene spotted him before he reached the counter. "Morning, sugar," she called, already pouring the black coffee he never had to order. Siobhan gave a small nod, a sliver of a smile breaking through his weathered features as he eased into the booth. He placed a thin, leather-bound notebook beside the salt shaker and folded his old bomber jacket carefully, patch side up, then tucked it to his right. The jacket looked like it had stories sewn into every crease, the kind that didn't belong in history books but in whispered memories around front porches. Siobhan opened the Millage Weekly Tribune, shook it out with the reverence of someone who still believed in print, and laid it across the table with quiet purpose. Nobody in town really knew when he first started showing up. He'd always just been there, same booth, same silence, same ritual. Every morning, he ordered buttermilk pancakes, no butter, 2 slices of crisp bacon, and left a folded $3 bill under the saucer before the plate even arrived. Some people thought he was just a quirky old man. Others knew better but said less. At 6:47 a.m., the front door burst open in a gust of cold wind and the clatter of a folder stuffed with flyers. Brandon Hale strode in, his coat unbuttoned and confidence spilling across the floor like spilled coffee. "Big week ahead, people," he chirped, waving the folder like a flag. 2 retirees nursing omelets barely looked up. Darlene offered a neutral nod as she topped off Mr. Kessler's cup, not breaking stride. Brandon made a beeline for the counter. "Triple shot today, Darlene. You wouldn't believe how far behind we are on these Veterans Day logistics." She raised a brow without looking at him. "How far behind are you on manners, sweetheart?" He chuckled, scanning the room. His eyes landed on Siobhan. "Still got the throne, I see," he said loud enough for most of the diner to hear. "Must be nice to have a permanent table." Darlene didn't respond immediately. She walked Chevin's breakfast across the room and set it down with practiced grace. "That man once pulled my son out of the path of a car that jumped the curb. Broke his wrist doing it. Never said a word. Just paid his bill and went home." Brandon's smirk faltered. "Huh. Didn't know that." Darlene looked at him sideways. "Lot of things you don't know, baby." Brandon wandered over to Chevin's booth, arms crossed, folder hugged to his chest like a shield. Siobhan didn't look up from his paper. Brandon tilted his head, eyes narrowing at the jacket. The triangular patch on the shoulder was faded into ghost blue, the threads nearly gone. "Looks like it came out of a donation bin," he muttered. "Bet it's seen too many winters." Siobhan turned a page, the movement slow and deliberate. His silver watch ticked quietly beneath the scratchy croon of Sinatra playing from the jukebox. Brandon leaned in a little. "Better hope it doesn't fall apart before the parade." From behind the counter, Darlene stopped pouring coffee. She looked up, not at Brandon, but at Siobhan. The paper in Chevin's hands stilled for a moment. He said nothing. The silence swelled, pressing against the windows and the tiled walls like steam from the kitchen. Brandon shifted, uncomfortable. He tapped the edge of the table twice. "Anyway. Big week. I'll leave you to your rituals." He turned and walked out, the folder swinging stiffly at his side. The bell above the door rang with a sound softer than before, as if it, too, had decided to hold its breath. Outside, the sun broke through the fogged diner windows, turning the laminate table gold and catching on the brass napkin holders. The light fell across the jacket, and for just a second, the patch caught the sun and gleamed like a memory. No one spoke. No one needed to. Siobhan folded his paper, took a small sip of coffee, and stared out the window as the early traffic began to roll past. He didn't need the attention. He didn't even seem to notice the way people looked at him differently now, with something between curiosity and guilt. All he needed was the booth, the pancakes, the quiet, and that jacket, worn thin, creased at the elbows, and stitched with more history than any parade banner could hold. That jacket would return the next morning, and the next after that. Always at 6:42. Always with Siobhan. Always in silence. But now, the silence felt like it was waiting for someone to listen. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Brandon Hale wasn't the kind of man to be haunted by old jackets or quiet men, but something about Siobhan's silence had followed him out the door that morning. He found himself glancing back through the diner's foggy windows, watching the man sip his coffee with the same precision as always. That patch. It shouldn't have meant anything. It was barely visible, frayed to the point of vanishing. But there was something about it, how Siobhan adjusted his jacket to keep it just uncovered, how the light had caught it at the exact moment Brandon had walked out. Like it had been meant for him to see. Like it had been a message, not just fabric. Later that afternoon, Brandon sat in his cluttered office at City Hall, flipping through the latest Veterans Day event schedule. Folding chairs. Parking permits. Marching routes. It all felt thin somehow, shallow. He leaned back in his squeaky chair, stared at the ceiling, then pulled his laptop closer. Out of instinct more than purpose, he typed "triangular military patch faded blue" into the search bar. The results were vague. Special Ops insignias. Decommissioned unit markers. Ghost stories from forums with usernames like ColdSteel83 and OldVet77. Nothing conclusive. Nothing that looked exactly like Siobhan's patch. He was still scrolling when Darlene's voice echoed in his mind. That man once saved her son. Broke his wrist doing it. Never said a word. Brandon had lived in Millage for almost a decade. He knew most of the old guard, retired teachers, war vets, former town officials, but Siobhan had always been a mystery. He didn't attend local events. Never spoke at town halls. Never submitted letters to the editor. And yet, somehow, he was always present. Always at the diner. Always in the park. Always near, but never in the spotlight. The next morning, Brandon skipped his usual run and headed straight for Maple and Pine. The cold hadn't fully lifted yet, and the air smelled like frozen grass and chimney smoke. When he pushed open the door, the bell rang its usual note, and there he was. Siobhan. Same booth. Same paper. Same coffee cup steaming in his hand. Brandon hesitated before approaching, then sat down across from him without asking. Siobhan didn't flinch. Didn't even blink. He simply folded the paper in half, set it aside, and looked at Brandon like he'd been expecting him. "I owe you an apology," Brandon said finally. "About the jacket." Siobhan said nothing. Just waited. Brandon exhaled. "I didn't mean to insult you. I was just... I don't know. Being a jerk, I guess." Siobhan lifted his coffee, took a slow sip, and set it down again. Then, finally, he spoke. "It's just a jacket," he said quietly. His voice was deep, rough like gravel softened by years. Brandon nodded, unsure whether to agree or challenge the obvious. "Yeah, but that patch, it's not just decoration, is it?" A flicker of something passed through Siobhan's eyes. Not emotion exactly, but a shift in pressure, like a door had cracked open just enough to let the wind whisper through. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for the edge of the table and adjusted the coat so the patch was squarely in view. Brandon leaned in without meaning to. The triangle was ghosted, almost silver now, its threads dulled by time. No letters, no numbers. Just shape and silence. Most people don't notice it, Siobhan said. Even fewer remember what it means. Brandon hesitated. But you still wear it. Siobhan's gaze didn't waver. Some things aren't worn for others. The words hung in the air like smoke. Brandon wanted to ask more, press further, dig until he hit the truth, but something in Siobhan's posture warned him off. This wasn't a man you pushed. This was a man you listened to, if he chose to speak. So Brandon changed tactics. Darlene told me what you did for her son. Siobhan blinked once. No acknowledgement. No denial. Just silence. Brandon leaned back. You don't like people talking about you, do you? Talking fills space. Doing fills time, Siobhan replied simply. It wasn't the answer Brandon expected. But it fit. He glanced at the patch again, then looked out the window. Cars drifted past on Pine Street, their tires humming over the frostbitten asphalt. He felt foolish for sitting there empty-handed, no real reason to be across from this man except a feeling he couldn't explain. Siobhan, he said finally, I think there's more to that jacket than you let on. The old man didn't smile, didn't flinch, didn't even breathe differently. He just looked at Brandon with eyes that had clearly seen too much and survived it all. There's more to everyone, Siobhan said. You just don't always get to see it. Brandon left the diner with more questions than answers. He walked slowly this time, past the bench where the local chess club gathered in warmer months, past the bakery that never opened before 9. He paused at the community bulletin board near City Hall. There was a flyer for the upcoming Veterans Day ceremony taped crookedly in the center. It looked flat. Lifeless. He thought of Siobhan sitting in silence, of that jacket folded so precisely, of a patch that meant something to someone, once. Back at his desk, Brandon pulled out his phone and texted Darlene. What else do you know about Siobhan? Anything before he moved here? A few minutes passed before her reply buzzed in. Don't know much. He's been here longer than I have. Never talks about the past. But I once saw him standing alone in Mosswood Park at 3 a.m. On a Tuesday. Just standing. Watching the flag. Brandon stared at the message. He didn't know what he'd expected, but it wasn't that. The image stayed with him all afternoon. A man alone in the dark, watching something most people only noticed during ceremonies and speeches. That night, Brandon dreamed of jungles he'd never walked through, of gunfire he'd never heard, and of a patch that gleamed in firelight before disappearing into the trees. And for the first time, he began to wonder if the Veterans Day ceremony they were planning, folding chairs, podium speeches, scripted honors, was missing the point entirely. Mosswood Park was always quiet before sunrise. The kind of quiet that clung to the trees and sat heavy over the benches like a fog that never quite lifted. Brandon had never paid attention to it before, not really. It was just a shortcut between Maple Street and the back entrance to City Hall. But this morning, he arrived early, before the buses stirred, before the town exhaled its first breath of motion. The dew was thick on the grass, the sky just beginning to shade from charcoal to navy. He was there for one reason, and his breath quickened as he spotted the lone figure near the memorial trail. Siobhan stood near bench 7, the oldest bench in the park, wooden and curved, still original, still defiant against the wave of molded plastic that had replaced its neighbors. He was brushing leaves off the backrest with gloved hands, slow and deliberate. A canvas tote lay by his feet. Brandon stopped a few yards away, unsure whether to call out or just observe. He felt like an intruder, an uninvited guest to something ancient and private. The older man didn't notice him at first. He moved with the rhythm of ritual, not obligation. From the tote, Siobhan pulled a small thermos and a folded cloth. He wiped down a bronze plaque embedded in the stone beneath the bench, then knelt, slowly, painfully, and reached for a small plastic vase that had toppled over during the weekend's wind. A marigold had fallen out. Siobhan picked it up with the care one might give a photograph or a folded flag and pressed it gently back into place. He adjusted a miniature American flag beside it so that it stood straight and centered. There was reverence in every motion. Brandon finally stepped forward, the crunch of gravel under his feet breaking the spell. Siobhan turned slightly but didn't rise. His expression didn't change. It didn't need to. "This area's off-limits during setup," Brandon said, trying to keep his voice neutral, official. "City ordinance says no non-credentialed volunteers during active layout hours." The words felt heavy coming out of his mouth, like stones wrapped in red tape. Siobhan didn't move. He simply looked up with the same calm that had unnerved Brandon in the diner. Then he nodded and gestured toward the plaque. No explanation. No defense. Just quiet understanding. Brandon hesitated. "We're taping zones for the Veterans Day program. Legal's all over liability this year. If something goes wrong," he stopped. He couldn't finish the sentence. It felt wrong to even say it. Siobhan stood with effort, knees cracking faintly, and reached into the tote once more. He pulled out a small wooden sign, clearly hand-carved, the words burned in blocky, careful lettering. "Remember them." He pressed it gently into the ground beside the walkway. Brandon opened his mouth again, unsure what to say, but a voice cut through the stillness behind them. "He makes one every year." A woman stepped out from behind the hedges. She was wrapped in a green field jacket 2 sizes too big, work gloves in one back pocket, and boots caked with morning soil. "And I leave it exactly where he puts it." Her name was Tina Alvarez, head of the park's maintenance crew. Brandon had worked with her on dozens of projects, but he'd never seen this side of her. Tina walked toward them, nodding to Siobhan. "Morning," she said gently. Then she turned to Brandon. "This spot? It's older than your event permit. He's been tending to it long before we had barricades and sign-in sheets." Brandon flushed. "Still, if it's not city-issued." Tina picked up a stray trash bag from the base of the nearest tree. "Then issue it," she said without looking back. "Or don't. But don't move it." She threw the bag into a bin and started walking the perimeter. Brandon turned back to Siobhan, who was now kneeling again, this time at a plaque that read Sergeant Diane M. Luring, 1960 to 1989. Pine needles had gathered in the grooves of the engraving. Siobhan brushed them away with the same reverent care. As he leaned forward, the faded patch on his jacket caught the rising light once again. Brandon stared at it, transfixed. It looked older in daylight. Not worn out, but weathered, as if time had tried to erase it and failed. From across the path, an old man on a nearby bench raised a hand in a shaky salute. Brandon recognized him as Mr. Ogden, a retired school principal who came to the park every morning with his thermos and binoculars. He sat wrapped in scarves, watching Siobhan like someone watching a veteran return to a battlefield. Brandon felt a twist in his chest. "Shevan's been doing this longer than my kids have been alive," Tina said softly as she returned with a rake in hand. "He never asks for thanks. Never tells anyone. Just shows up. Even during the blizzard last year, he shoveled a path to every single marker. I found out days later. Saw the prints in the snow." Brandon crossed his arms tightly, searching for something to hold on to. "Still wearing that jacket, huh?" His tone tried for humor, but it cracked halfway through. Tina didn't laugh. She watched Siobhan for a moment longer and said nothing. "It's just an old jacket," Brandon muttered, not sure who he was trying to convince. Siobhan paused, then reached for the collar and gently pulled it up over the patch. He stood, nodded to Mr. Ogden, and walked slowly toward the edge of the park. Brandon bent down and picked up the small wooden sign. The letters were slightly crooked, burned in by hand, and the wood smelled faintly of ash and oil. He stared at it for a long moment before shaking his head and setting it back exactly where Siobhan had left it. You really don't know, do you? Tina asked quietly. Brandon looked at her. Know what? She smiled sadly and didn't answer. As Siobhan disappeared into the mist, Brandon felt something shift around him, not in the park, but inside his own chest. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like an echo of something deeper, something sacred. And in that moment, he realized that some rituals didn't need permits. They needed only presence. The next morning came cloaked in fog, the kind that muffled footsteps and made even the most familiar places feel distant. Brandon walked into Mosswood Park again, this time not as an official or a planner, but as a witness. He didn't carry a clipboard, didn't wear his city-issued fleece. He wore an old windbreaker and jeans, blending into the landscape like someone who had no task to complete but didn't want to be home either. He knew where to go now. He didn't have to search. Bench 7 waited at the edge of the gravel path, its wood still damp with morning dew. Siobhan was already there, his canvas tote beside him, the small flag he had fixed yesterday still standing straight in the vase. Brandon hung back, unsure whether his presence would be welcomed or simply tolerated again. Siobhan moved with the same slow precision, his gloved hand brushing dust from another nameplate embedded in stone. This one belonged to Sergeant Diane M. Loring. There was a bouquet of pine cones tucked beside the marker, likely left by a child, or someone who didn't know what else to offer. Siobhan didn't move it. He simply adjusted the placement with a gentleness that felt almost paternal. Then he stood, his knees clicking faintly, and looked up. He saw Brandon and gave a nod. It wasn't an invitation, not quite, but it wasn't dismissal either. Brandon stepped closer. You do this every day? He asked. Siobhan's face didn't change. Not every day. Just the ones that matter. Brandon took a moment to digest the answer. And how do you decide which days matter? Siobhan looked at the row of plaques stretching across the lawn, each marked by a name, a rank, and a span of years. They tell me, he said simply. Brandon followed his gaze. The fog clung to the earth like smoke from a battlefield, softening the edges of everything it touched. He wondered how many stories were buried here, how many people passed these markers without ever seeing them. You ever talk about your own service? He asked quietly. Siobhan turned his head slowly, eyes narrowing slightly. Talking's for when you're done learning. I'm not done yet. The reply landed with a weight Brandon couldn't explain. He shifted his stance, uncomfortable. I looked into that patch, he said. Couldn't find anything. No unit. No official record. It's like it doesn't exist. Siobhan's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something close. That's the point. Brandon waited, hoping more would follow. It didn't. Siobhan pulled the edge of his jacket tighter, as if sealing something in, then walked slowly toward another plaque. Brandon followed at a respectful distance. The new marker belonged to Lieutenant Thomas Callahan. It was older, the engraving worn by rain and years of sunlight. Siobhan knelt again, this time with less strain than before, and placed a single white flower at the base of the stone. Brandon didn't speak. Somehow, it felt like any noise would fracture the moment. He thought about what Darlene had said. About Siobhan saving her son and never saying a word. He thought about Tina Alvarez, brushing snow off headstones in Siobhan's wake. These weren't acts performed for recognition. They weren't service in the conventional sense. They were something deeper, older. Something sacred. Brandon took out his phone, instinctively wanting to capture the moment, but hesitated. It felt wrong to photograph a man grieving. Because that's what this was, he realized. This wasn't maintenance. It wasn't ritual for its own sake. It was grief, tended like a garden, revisited not for closure, but for keeping something alive. As Siobhan stood once more, the morning sun finally broke through the fog in a single shaft, landing squarely on his shoulder. The triangular patch shimmered faintly in the light. Brandon stepped closer. "That patch," he said softly, "what does it really mean?" Siobhan didn't answer immediately. He looked down at the patch, the edges frayed, the colors nearly gone. Then he spoke. "It means I walked where others wouldn't. That's all." Brandon swallowed. It wasn't the definition he expected. It wasn't official. But it rang with more truth than anything he'd found in city records or online databases. They stood there in silence for a while, both facing the rows of names. Finally, Siobhan turned and began walking away, his boots leaving shallow prints in the soft gravel. Brandon called after him, not with authority, not even with urgency, just a question born of something heavier than curiosity. "Why do you keep doing this?" Siobhan didn't turn around. He lifted a hand slightly, enough to be seen but not dramatic. His voice floated back, low and steady. "Because someone should." Brandon stayed long after Siobhan had gone, standing still in the middle of the path while the park stirred to life around him. Squirrels darted from tree to tree. A jogger passed by with earbuds in and a neon vest. Somewhere, a dog barked. But none of it felt as loud as the silence Siobhan left behind. It echoed, not in the air, but in Brandon's chest, demanding something he hadn't quite named yet. That afternoon, he sat in his office again, staring at the flyer for the Veterans Day ceremony. The text was neat. The layout clean. It listed guest speakers, scheduled times, and parking zones. But it felt hollow. Like a cake with no sugar. He picked up a pen and scribbled across the top, "Find out what really matters." Then he circled the name of the guest of honor, a retired general named Torrance, and underlined it twice. Maybe, just maybe, someone else knew what that patch meant. Maybe someone else had walked where Siobhan had walked. The morning of the Veterans Day ceremony arrived with skies bruised by low clouds and a kind of wind that found its way through coat collars and sleeves. Mosswood Park had been transformed overnight into a patriotic sprawl of folding chairs, paper flags, and taped-off sections marked with event signage. Middle schoolers in matching navy cardigans fidgeted in their seats, their choir instructor shushing them as brass musicians tuned their instruments behind the bandstand. A makeshift podium stood center stage, festooned with red, white and blue bunting, slightly crooked. Brandon stood just behind it, shuffling notecards with clammy fingers, heart hammering against his ribs like a drum out of sync. He had rehearsed his welcome speech 10 times, practiced the names twice as many, but it wasn't the script that made him nervous. It was the presence he felt. Just at the edge of the crowd. Siobhan had arrived quietly, without announcement or fanfare, settling into the last bench near the oak tree that cast a wide shadow across the memorial lawn. He wore his jacket, zipped halfway, the triangular patch barely visible beneath folded arms. A cane rested beside him, though Brandon suspected he didn't really need it. His cap sat low, and his gaze was directed downward, not out of disrespect but something more private, like prayer. Brandon glanced toward him before taking the mic. For a moment, he debated abandoning the script altogether, but duty kept him steady. The microphone crackled as he leaned in. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us in honoring the men and women who've served this nation with courage, dedication, and humility." The words felt empty even as he spoke them, their polish too perfect for the raw truth that hovered just beneath the surface. Please join me in welcoming our guest of honor, retired General Elaine Torrance, decorated veteran of the 101st Airborne, recipient of the Silver Star, Bronze Star, and Legion of Merit. Polite applause spread across the crowd as 2 ROTC cadets emerged from the side path, flanking the general like sentinels. She walked between them with a presence that silenced even the restless children. Her boots pressed into the grass with the calm authority of someone who had led troops through sandstorms and firefights. Her hair, silver and braided into a tight coil, framed a face carved by command and endurance. Her uniform coat was adorned with rows of ribbons and insignia, gleaming like medals on a cathedral wall. Brandon stepped back as she ascended the platform. She nodded once at him, then turned to face the crowd. But before she spoke, she paused. Her eyes scanned the assembly, passed over the choir, the veterans seated in the first two rows, the local officials in their windbreakers. Then she stopped. Mid-step. Her gaze had landed on the far bench beneath the oak tree. Her entire posture changed, like a soldier spotting a familiar silhouette across enemy lines. The crowd noticed. The air grew still. General Torrance stepped off the platform. There was no announcement, no music, no prompting. Just the quiet crunch of boots crossing grass as she walked away from the stage. Brandon froze. The choir director blinked in confusion. Even the flag at the front of the park, which had been whipping moments before, now hung still, caught in the eye of something greater than weather. All eyes followed her as she approached the bench. Siobhan didn't move. His head remained slightly bowed, hands resting calmly atop his cane. The patch on his jacket, that ghost of a symbol, caught the light again. The general stopped 3 feet in front of him. Then, with the fluid precision of decades spent in the service, she brought her right hand to her brow in a crisp, unwavering salute. The sound of her glove brushing her temple was the only noise in the park. Even the wind obeyed the moment. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A woman clutched her husband's arm. A teacher dropped her program. A child, no older than 8, pointed with a whisper that sliced through the silence. "That's Mr. Siobhan." Brandon felt his throat tighten. The note card in his hand slipped, fluttering like a lost leaf. He couldn't look away. The general held the salute longer than protocol required, longer than anyone expected. And when she finally lowered her hand, she spoke, her voice steady and clear. "That patch was only issued to 5 men in the history of our operations. He's the last one standing." Gasps moved through the audience like a wave. No one clapped. No one dared. Siobhan finally looked up. For the first time, Brandon saw him fully, not just as the quiet man at the booth or the caretaker in the shadows, but as something far more profound. A pillar. A keeper. A warrior whose war had never really ended. He stood slowly, adjusting the jacket with care. Then, without a word, he returned the salute. It was smaller, more intimate, but it carried just as much weight. As the final note of that silent exchange hung in the air, a lone trumpet began playing taps. It wasn't planned. A student in the back row, moved by instinct or something deeper, had raised the silver instrument to his lips and offered up the only language the moment deserved. The notes floated through the branches, soft and mournful, wrapping around the crowd like mist. The general stepped back, her expression unreadable, and returned to the stage without looking back. Siobhan sat again, the patch once more hidden in the folds of his coat. But everyone had seen it now. Everyone knew. Brandon stared at the mic as if it might bite him. His planned words felt like lies. He stepped forward anyway and adjusted it. His voice cracked, then steadied. "Some service," he said, "goes unseen not because it's small, but because it's so vast, so profound, we don't always recognize it when it's sitting quietly among us. Today, we've been reminded." No one applauded. But no one forgot. And from that day on, the corner booth at Maple and Pine would never be viewed the same again. The booth was empty for the first time in years. It startled Darlene more than she cared to admit. The bell above Maple and Pine gave its usual soft ring as Brandon stepped inside, but there was no nod from the corner, no slow unfolding of the morning paper, no jacket draped carefully on the bench. The quiet in the diner felt different now, less like peace and more like absence. Outside, the sky hung low with gray, and the sidewalk still gleamed with the dampness of a morning drizzle. Brandon moved without hesitation toward the corner booth, his footsteps slowed only by the weight in his chest. There, folded neatly on the table where the pancakes usually sat, was Cheven's jacket. For once, the patch wasn't obscured or hidden. It was exposed, facing upward as though left with purpose. Beside it, a diner receipt lay flat, blank except for the timestamp and a name written in smooth, looping cursive, Siobhan. He approached as though the booth were a chapel, reverent and cautious. Setting his messenger bag on the opposite bench, he sat down like a man unsure whether he had the right to be there. His eyes studied the jacket, the creased sleeves, the worn cuffs, the frayed stitching at the elbows. He reached forward with hesitant fingers and lifted the corner of the receipt. Just beneath it, folded into a square, was a napkin. He opened it slowly. 5 words in the same careful handwriting greeted him. Some honors don't come with ceremony. Brandon leaned back, exhaling through his nose. He didn't touch the jacket again. Darlene appeared beside him a moment later, setting down 2 mugs, one already half full. She said nothing at first, only offering a tired smile as she slid into the seat across from him. "Didn't think I'd see you here before 9, she said gently. Brandon stared at the coffee, then back at the jacket. "Did he say anything when he left it?" Darlene shook her head. "Just asked for your usual table. Didn't say much. But then again, he never did." Brandon ran a hand down his face, trying to organize the emotions colliding inside him. "How long have you known?" he asked. "About who he really is?" Darlene didn't answer immediately. She glanced at the patch, her fingers brushing the edge of the table. "I don't know what I knew. Just enough. Enough to trust the quiet." He studied her face, the way it softened when she spoke of Siobhan. "You once said he helped your son." She nodded, her voice lowering. "Norman was 6. Ran out into Miller Street chasing a balloon. A car came out of nowhere. Siobhan moved like lightning, caught him mid-step. Broke his wrist in the process. Refused the ambulance, just smiled and said, 'It's just a sprain.' Never told anyone." Brandon swallowed hard. "And you never did either?" She offered a small shrug. "Wasn't mine to tell." The bell above the door rang again. Tina Alvarez entered, shaking off the drizzle from her navy work jacket. She spotted them immediately and made her way over. "Figured I'd find you 2 here," she said, sliding into the seat beside Darlene. "Figured I might as well add my piece." Brandon gestured toward the jacket. "Be my guest." Tina folded her hands and stared at the coat. 2 years ago, week before Christmas, a storm hit. Power went down at Mosswood. Couldn't get the maintenance crew out until Monday. But Saturday morning, every headstone was clear. Every path shoveled. Lanterns relit. Not one call. Not one complaint. Darlene smiled knowingly. "Let me guess. Siobhan." Tina nodded. "I only found the receipt later. A small slip in the donation box from the gas station. Signed, H. Mercer, Night Crew. That's what he put on the line for the name. Night Crew." Brandon's jaw tightened as he glanced again at the jacket. It was like holding a key to a room you weren't sure you were ready to enter. "He was right there," he murmured, "every day. And I barely noticed." Tina tapped the table lightly. "He didn't need the spotlight. He just needed a purpose." Behind the counter, the radio shifted to a slow, wistful tune from the 1940s, something swingy but subdued. The older customers nodded along, their memories drifting through the melody. Brandon reached out carefully and refolded the jacket, brushing a few crumbs off the cushion. Then he stood, holding it against his chest as though it were made of glass. Across the room, a young boy no older than 7 raised a shy hand. Brandon blinked. It was Norman Jr. The boy wore a denim jacket with 2 small American flag pins on the collar. Brandon gave him a faint nod in return. The kid grinned, then ducked behind his father's seat. Brandon turned back to the table and tucked the jacket carefully under his arm. I need to find him, he said quietly. Millage's library didn't have a computer database, but it had Maggie, and that was better. The building smelled of old pages and lemon wax, and the door squealed in that familiar way as he entered. Maggie sat at the reference desk, a half-finished crossword in front of her and a chipped teacup that had never left a stain. She didn't look up. "Took you long enough," she said. Brandon blinked. "Excuse me?" Maggie smiled. "I figured you'd be in by noon at the latest. Man leaves a coat and a riddle, someone's bound to want answers." He approached slowly. "How did you?" "Darlene called," she said with a wink. "Said your face had the look of someone trying to read Braille with gloves on." Brandon couldn't help a quiet laugh. "I'm looking for anything about Siobhan. Military records. News clippings. Anything." Maggie's smile shifted from playful to purposeful. "I was in school with his sister. Quiet family. Too quiet sometimes." She stood, the bronze owl pin on her cardigan catching the light. "Come on. You won't find him on Google." But truths curled up in drawer 6B. As they walked toward the archives, Brandon felt something stir in his chest. A weight, but not the kind that crushed. The kind that led you forward. Like a hand on your back, steady and sure. He didn't know what the jacket would lead to. But he knew this much now. Siobhan had never disappeared. He had simply chosen to stay unseen. The library's archive room hadn't changed in decades. The air inside was cooler, drier, and held the faint scent of newsprint, beeswax, and age. Dust floated in narrow sunbeams like powdered ghosts, suspended between timelines. Maggie moved with practiced ease, her sensible shoes whispering across the tile as she pulled open a drawer labeled 6B. Her fingers tapped over file tabs until they landed on a familiar name. "Start around 72, she said, pulling out a reel of microfilm. "Southeast Asia operations. Look for bylines from Winslow." He was local, but he followed the blackouts and the missions nobody would put their names on. Brandon took the reel and fed it into the old microfilm reader. The screen buzzed to life with a pale blue glow, and the whirring of the reels filled the silence. For the next hour, he scrolled through headline after headline, his eyes adjusting to the staccato rhythm of war stories, foreign names, and casualty counts. The articles bled together until, somewhere between page 47 and 53, he stopped cold. The headline read, "5 rescued from Nightfall Drop, Hero Remains Unnamed." Beneath it, a grainy black and white photo showed 4 soldiers huddled around a medevac chopper, 2 of them bandaged, one leaning heavily on the other. The caption was vague. "Survivors report an unidentified airman navigated an improvised evacuation under blackout conditions after the pilot was killed in action. Carried 2 wounded men more than 3 miles through hostile jungle. Patch described as triangular, origin unknown." Brandon read the paragraph 3 times. His throat felt dry. He looked at Maggie, who had been watching him quietly from a few feet away. "That's him, isn't it?" he said. Maggie stepped closer and peered over his shoulder. "That's the closest anyone ever got to printing it," she replied. They followed up for months, but he never answered the door. Never picked up the phone. And Winslow? He had contacts. He would have known if the guy was dead. No. Siobhan just disappeared. Brandon sat back, stunned by the implications. He was there. He did that. And then he vanished into a diner booth and a park bench. Maggie gave him a look. "Or maybe," she said gently, "he just chose where to keep showing up." He scrolled farther. A few days later, a follow-up story ran. "Unit affiliation unknown, Pentagon declines comment." A brief line caught Brandon's eye. Pentagon sources declined to confirm whether the insignia worn during the rescue corresponded to any known special operations branch, stating only that the mission was considered off-record. The wording was deliberate. Coded. This wasn't just a brave soldier. This was someone who had been erased for reasons far above a field commander's pay grade. Brandon stood and paced the edge of the room, eyes unfocused. Why wouldn't he come forward? He could have been honored. He could have been a national figure. Someone people looked up to. Maggie leaned against the edge of the cabinet, arms crossed. Maybe he didn't want that. Maybe what he did wasn't about being seen. Or maybe, what he did wasn't something they wanted seen. Brandon turned back toward her. You think it was classified? Maggie nodded slowly. Deep classified. Enough that his records were likely sealed, or redacted to the point of nothing. That's what happened to people like him. Men they called when no one else would go. And when it was over, they were told, now forget it happened. She paused, then added, but he didn't forget. Brandon looked at the microfilm again, at the photo of exhausted men and the blurred figure in the background, tall, narrow-shouldered, face half hidden in the shadows. That was Siobhan. Not sitting silently in a diner. Not brushing off benches. But hauling bloodied men through jungle under fire. And no one knew. No one was meant to. He gathered his things, mind racing. I need to talk to him, he said. I need to tell him we know. Maggie raised an eyebrow. You sure he wants to be found? Brandon hesitated. No. But I think I need to find him anyway. Later that afternoon, he found the last known address listed in the city records. An old rental near Chestnut Street, tucked behind a leaning gate and a porch with no railing. The mailbox clattered when he opened it. Empty. He knocked. No answer. The curtains were drawn. The yard was overgrown. He stepped back, disappointment building in his chest like pressure in a sealed jar. A voice called out from next door. You looking for Siobhan? Brandon turned. An older man in a heavy coat and a wool cap leaned against a porch post, a cane in his right hand. He looked at Brandon over the top of rimless glasses. Yeah, Brandon said. I'm with the city. I just wanted to talk. The man nodded once. Name's Thomas. Known Siobhan since '64. He's not home today. Brandon took a step closer. Do you know where he is? Thomas tapped the cane on the step. Sunday. 3 p.m. Veterans Section. Hillrest Cemetery. Rain or shine. He's always there. Brandon furrowed his brow. Every Sunday. Every one I can remember, Thomas said. Then, before Brandon could speak again, he added, he's not hiding, son. He just doesn't need to be found. The words hit harder than they should have. Brandon nodded slowly, thanked him, and walked back toward his car. The sky was starting to clear, but he didn't notice. All he could think about was the line from the napkin. Some honors don't come with ceremony. Back at his apartment, Brandon sat at the kitchen table, the jacket folded beside him like a sacred relic. He opened his calendar and circled Sunday with a thick, deliberate stroke. Beneath it, he wrote 2 words. Go quietly. He wouldn't bring flowers. He wouldn't bring speeches. He would just walk. He would stand. And he would listen. Sunday arrived with a stillness that felt earned. The clouds above Hillrest Cemetery drifted like slow-moving ships, and the air smelled faintly of damp leaves and cold granite. Brandon parked his car near the western gate, the veterans section just beyond a winding gravel path lined with old sycamores. He walked with measured steps, his coat zipped tight, the collar turned up against the breeze. In his hand, he held a single white flower, no bouquet, no ribbon, just one honest bloom. It felt right that way. As the path curved past a row of low headstones, he saw Siobhan. The old man stood with his back straight despite the cane in his right hand. He wore no jacket today, only a charcoal sweater and dark slacks. His hands were clasped behind him, and his eyes were fixed on a headstone marked Lieutenant Thomas Callahan, 1944 to 1968. The name was weathered, softened by time, but the memory behind it seemed sharpened by the man who stood before it. Brandon didn't speak. He approached slowly, stopping a respectful distance away. Siobhan didn't turn, but he acknowledged him with a small nod. The two stood there, side by side in silence, the only sounds the rustling of dry leaves and the distant chirp of a single bird. After a while, Siobhan lowered his gaze and placed his white flower at the base of the stone. Brandon followed, kneeling gently and setting his own flower beside it. The stems touched, leaning into one another like old comrades. "He was 23, Siobhan said at last, his voice deep and low. Had a laugh that cracked through radio static. Carried a photo in his helmet. Never told me who the woman was. I never asked." Brandon remained still. He knew better than to interrupt. "He called me Cap, even though I was younger. Said I had that look. Whatever that meant." Siobhan exhaled. "We were both kids. Too many of us were." Brandon stood beside him again, unsure how to respond. After a moment, he said softly, "I read the articles. I saw the microfilm. The evacuation under blackout. The patch they couldn't identify. That was you, wasn't it?" Siobhan gave a single nod. "It was one of many. That one just happened to get out." Brandon hesitated. "What was it called, your unit?" Siobhan's eyes didn't move from the stone. "It wasn't called anything, not officially. We were a triangle team. 3-man operations. Deep recon. Blackout deployment. No IDs. No ranks. No medals. Just missions." Brandon blinked. "Triangle, like the patch." Siobhan looked down at the ghosted emblem on his folded jacket, which rested on the bench beside him. "That's all they gave us. A symbol. No name. No country. Just the triangle. They said it meant we could go in and come out through 3 points. But we knew the truth. It meant there were 3 of us, and only 2 usually came back." Brandon's stomach turned slightly. He thought about the photo from the article, the one where only 4 men stood beside the chopper. "You carried 2 of them out, didn't you?" Siobhan nodded again. "They were bleeding bad. One in the leg, one in the gut. I didn't have a radio. The pilot was dead. I carried them until I couldn't. Then I dragged them. One on each shoulder. Took me 6 hours." Brandon tried to imagine it, but the image wouldn't form. "Not clearly." "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" he asked. Siobhan finally turned to look at him, his gaze calm but piercing. "Because if I told it, it would become a story. Something people would clap for. Cheer. And it wasn't that. It was screaming. It was crawling. It was 2 men asking me not to stop even when I was sure I would die too. You don't tell that kind of story. You carry it." The words settled heavy between them. Brandon felt his throat tighten again. "But you still wore the jacket," he said. "Even when no one understood." Siobhan gave a small smile, almost bitter. "Wearing it isn't for them. It's for me. Every day I put it on, it reminds me they didn't die alone. That someone came back. And that someone still remembers." They stood there for several more minutes, the quiet broken only by the wind playing with the leaves near their feet. Brandon finally broke the silence. "General Torrance recognized the patch. She saluted you like you were the last survivor of something sacred." Siobhan's expression softened. "She was one of us. Not triangle, but close. Different team. Different ghost. She knew the price." Brandon thought about the parade, the speeches, the perfectly spaced folding chairs. None of it had prepared him for this. The ceremony yesterday, that moment between you and her, it changed everything. Siobhan chuckled faintly. It changed nothing. It just revealed what was always there. Brandon nodded, unsure what to say. He looked back at the flower, now bent slightly in the breeze, brushing against its twin. What happens now? He asked. Siobhan stared ahead. Now. Now you decide what to do with what you know. Because knowing means responsibility. It means you don't get to unsee it. You can ignore it, sure. But if you do, you're no better than the silence they left behind. Brandon looked at him, the full weight of that truth settling in. I won't ignore it, he said. I can't. Siobhan nodded once. Good. Then maybe it's time someone else started carrying the weight. Brandon followed him out of the cemetery, the gravel crunching underfoot. They didn't speak as they walked. They didn't need to. And when they reached the gate, Siobhan turned, looked back at the rows of stones, and gave a nod that was more than farewell. It was permission. To remember. To act. To carry. Brandon didn't know exactly what the next step was. But he knew this much. The jacket wasn't just cloth. The patch wasn't just thread. And Siobhan wasn't just a man. He was the reminder of what silence could mean when it came from someone who had earned the right to speak but chose not to. By the following week, the word had started to spread, not because Brandon told anyone, but because stories like Siobhan's had a way of whispering through the right cracks. They didn't need headlines or announcements. They just found their way into the air, passed hand to hand like a folded note. Sunday came again, crisp and dry, the early autumn wind curling through Millage like a quiet hymn. Brandon arrived at Hillrest Cemetery 10 minutes early, unsure if Siobhan would be there, unsure if he even should be. But as he rounded the curve past the sycamores, he saw him. Same stance. Same bench. Same grave. Siobhan stood before Lieutenant Callahan's stone as if the past was still audible, as if somewhere beneath the earth, voices still called out through static-filled radios. Brandon approached slowly, carrying nothing but his hands. The week before, the flower had felt like a gesture. Today, his presence had to be the offering. Siobhan didn't look over when Brandon stopped beside him. He simply nodded, and that was enough. They stood together for a long time without speaking. The leaves rustled at their feet, and a single crow called out from a nearby branch. The town's church bells chimed softly in the distance, a sound that barely made it past the gates. Siobhan reached down and adjusted a small stone that had been placed off-center near the base of the headstone. It was a flat piece of granite, likely picked from a gravel path, but it rested now like it belonged, like a quiet reminder that someone had visited and left something behind. Brandon watched him work. Every movement was deliberate, unhurried. It wasn't a routine. It was something older than that. A devotion. Do you come here for him or for you? Brandon asked softly. Siobhan didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the headstone as if weighing every word. Both, he finally said. I owe him more than memory. I owe him presence. When you carry someone out of fire, you don't get to forget. You stand where they can't. That's the deal. Brandon took a slow breath. He looked around. The veterans section was tidy, the grass freshly cut, the flag standing straight. It was clear now that this wasn't the city's doing. It had never been. It was Siobhan's hands that kept the markers clean, Siobhan's tools that cleared the weeds, Siobhan's discipline that filled the silence with something sacred. How long have you been coming? Brandon asked. Siobhan straightened up, his cane steady at his side. Since 73. Every Sunday I could walk. Brandon did the math in his head. That was over 2,000 Sundays. Rain, snow, sun, illness. No fanfare. No thanks. Just one man keeping a promise no one had asked him to make. You ever miss one? He asked. Siobhan shook his head. Once. Blizzard of '96. Snowed in at the hospital. I sent a nurse with the flower. She didn't understand. But she brought it. I made sure. The wind picked up, and Brandon folded his arms against the chill. I used to think Veterans Day was about speeches, he said. Marching bands. Flags. But that salute from General Torrance, it rewired something in me. Like she wasn't saluting just you, but every name on every stone you've ever stood before. Siobhan gave a small grunt that might have been agreement. Or it might have been memory. Elaine was good, he said. She knew how to lead because she never forgot how to listen. We all had a file like this. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook, worn at the edges. Names. Coordinates. Timetables. But I started writing letters. Never mailed them. Just wrote them. Brandon blinked. Letters to the fallen. Siobhan nodded. Sometimes to them. Sometimes to myself. Sometimes to whoever might read it after I'm gone. They're not tidy. Just thoughts. I leave one here every November. Folded under a rock. No one's taken them. But I think someone always reads them. Brandon crouched and looked closer at the base of the headstone. Sure enough, tucked behind a curve in the stone, a weathered envelope lay folded in half, a rock holding it in place. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded. How many have you written? He asked. More than I'll admit, Siobhan said with a hint of a smile. A movement behind them caught Brandon's attention. A young woman and her daughter approached slowly, both holding small American flags. The girl was no more than 10, her steps uncertain as she clutched the flag with both hands. The woman nodded to Siobhan as they passed, her voice barely above a whisper. We just came to say thank you. Siobhan returned the nod but said nothing. The girl laid her flag near another headstone before retreating to her mother's side. The two disappeared into the trees. Brandon turned to Siobhan. People are starting to notice. Siobhan's expression didn't change. Let them. But don't turn it into something it's not. This place isn't a stage. Brandon nodded. He understood now. The ritual wasn't for glory. It wasn't even for grief. It was for balance. For making sure silence didn't turn into forgetting. As the sun began to rise higher, Siobhan moved toward another marker. Brandon followed. They made their way down the row together, one marker at a time, straightening flowers, brushing off dirt, realigning flags. It was quiet work. Humble. Holy. And by the time they reached the far end of the section, Brandon realized something he hadn't seen before. Each grave bore a subtle symbol. A small triangle etched into the lower corner of the stone. Barely visible. Easily missed. But present. He crouched to examine one. You did this? Siobhan nodded. They wouldn't give us markers. So I gave them one. Quietly. Nobody ever noticed. Except those who needed to. Brandon touched the symbol gently. This is your unit. No, Siobhan said. This is theirs. I just remembered it. The two men stood together, looking out over the rows of names, the quiet of the place wrapping around them like a prayer without words. Brandon knew he would return the next Sunday. Not for the tradition. Not for the job. But for the meaning. And the ritual would go on, just as it always had. The town of Milledge was quiet in the days that followed, but something beneath the surface had begun to shift. In the wake of the ceremony, of the salute and the trumpet's cry, stories began circulating, not shouted, but passed from one pair of knowing eyes to another. No one declared it, no banner was hung, but it was clear, Siobhan was no longer just the man at the booth. People were beginning to remember a man they had never really known. At City Hall, Brandon stared at the event report he was supposed to file. It sat on his desk, pages blank, the words unwilling to form. The standard language, attendance, budget use, community engagement, felt grotesquely out of place. He had written hundreds of reports before, but never one that needed to account for a moment when a general stepped off a stage and offered a salute that cracked open the town's history like a vault. He shut the file, grabbed his coat, and headed for the park. Mosswood was nearly empty. A few retirees walked their dogs, and a teenage couple sat beneath the oak tree whispering in tones too soft to carry. Brandon walked the path toward bench 7 and found it already occupied. Tina Alvarez sat there, wearing a brown utility jacket with a ball cap pulled low. A rake leaned against her knee, and a half-full garbage bag rustled by her feet. She looked up and smiled as he approached. "Didn't think I'd see you on a Thursday," she said. Brandon shrugged. "Didn't think I'd be drawn back here this much, but here we are." He sat beside her and glanced around. "You ever feel like this place breathes differently now?" Tina nodded. "Because it does. Because we're finally listening." Brandon paused, then looked at her. "You ever talk with Siobhan? Like really talk?" She nodded again, slower this time. "A few times. Never asked for it. Just happened. He'd be brushing off a bench, and I'd be emptying a trash can. Next thing you know, he's telling you something that makes you sit still and forget what you came to do." Brandon waited. Tina tilted her head back, gazing up through the bare branches. "Last winter," she began, "big storm hit just before Christmas. Power lines down. Park was frozen over. City maintenance wasn't getting out until after the holiday. I figured we'd leave the cleanup till Monday." She turned toward him, eyes narrowing. "But when I came in that Saturday, every path was shoveled. Every memorial clear. Even the lanterns had been relit with new bulbs." Brandon blinked. "You're saying Siobhan did it?" Tina gave a slow smile. "I found the receipt days later. Taped to the back of the maintenance door. Paid in cash. Signed, H. Mercer, Night Crew. That's what he called himself." She laughed quietly. "Night Crew. As if he were just another guy on a shift." Brandon shook his head. "He did all that, and no one even saw him." Tina leaned forward, hands clasped. "That's what made it matter. He wasn't trying to be seen. He just couldn't let the place go untended." She looked back toward the memorial path. "You know, sometimes I think people like Siobhan don't need to be remembered with speeches. They're remembered by what they leave standing." Brandon stared down at his hands. "He ever talk about the war?" Tina nodded. "Bits and pieces. Never linear. Like puzzle pieces from different boxes. But you could feel it. Every word had weight. Every silence had more." She stood and picked up the rake. "One night, I asked him if he ever wanted a medal. He said, I already got one. Just didn't pin it to my chest. I didn't ask what he meant, but I think it's the jacket. That patch. That's the medal. And he wears it because he's still serving." Brandon watched her walk toward the maintenance shed. Something about her words wouldn't leave him. He walked the trail, past each bench, each plaque, and every flag that had been adjusted with care. When he reached the final turn, he stopped. A girl, no older than 12, stood by one of the headstones with her arms wrapped around a blue backpack. Her jacket was too big for her, and her sneakers were soaked from the grass. She turned when she heard him, startled but not afraid. "I'm sorry," she said. "Am I not supposed to be here?" Brandon shook his head. "You're fine. I'm just surprised to see someone so young out here alone." She looked back at the headstone. "I'm not alone. That's my great-uncle. Mom said he was a soldier. Died before I was born. I wanted to see where he was. Brandon took a step closer, noting the name on the stone. Private First Class Robert Lee Winslow. He looked back at her. Winslow. Any relation to the reporter? She smiled shyly. Yeah. That was his brother. Grandpa said the reporter followed the war stories because he couldn't go himself. Brandon crouched beside the stone. He was part of the same operation, he said gently. As someone else I know. The girl nodded. I met the man. Siobhan. He talked to me once. Brandon looked at her, surprised. He did. The girl nodded again. Last month. I was crying here because I didn't know anything about my uncle. Siobhan came by and told me to sit. Said I didn't need to know everything. Just enough to care. Brandon smiled. That sounds like him. The girl knelt and pulled a folded drawing from her backpack, a crayon sketch of a man in a jacket with a triangle on the sleeve. I drew him. I didn't get his face right. But I remembered the patch. She set the drawing gently against the stone. He said heroes don't always get statues. Sometimes they get benches. Or napkins. Or kids who remember to sit quietly. Brandon stood, a lump forming in his throat. What's your name? He asked. Lena, she replied. Well, Lena, he said, I think you've just given the best tribute anyone ever has. She blushed, then stood and brushed her knees off. I have to go. Mom's waiting. But I'll be back. He said the names here don't speak unless we listen. As she disappeared down the trail, Brandon looked at the drawing resting beside the headstone. It fluttered in the breeze but didn't blow away. It stayed, like Siobhan's memory, like the truth that now lived in more than one heart. And for the first time, Brandon knew the story wouldn't be forgotten, not because it was finally being told, but because someone, even someone small, had learned how to listen. The jacket had been hanging in Brandon's hallway for 4 days. Folded carefully, untouched except for the single time he'd lifted the cuff to brush away a dust mote. He hadn't felt ready to handle it yet, as if disturbing it too soon would undo something sacred. But that morning, with sunlight creeping across his floor and the sound of birdsong barely audible beyond the window, he knew the moment had arrived. He placed the jacket gently on the kitchen table, the fabric soft and heavy beneath his fingers. There was something intimate about its weight, like holding memory itself. He turned it over carefully, inspecting the seams, the edges, the way the patch sat just above the left shoulder. It was faint, more silver than blue now, its triangle shape worn down to near invisibility. Brandon had seen 100 military patches in books, in museums, on uniformed shoulders, but nothing like this. This wasn't a symbol of rank or regiment. It was a wound sealed in thread. His fingers moved along the inner lining, brushing the fabric until they met a strange ridge, almost imperceptible. He paused. With extreme care, he pulled the seam slightly apart. There, hidden between the layers of the coat, was a sliver of something stiffer than cloth. He reached for a small pair of tweezers and gently teased it free. It was a piece of oilcloth, folded into a triangle to match the patch on the outside. When he opened it, a faded ink map revealed itself, lines and coordinates, topography of a place not labeled in any language he could immediately recognize. Jungle terrain. Markings in shorthand. And in the center, a red dot marked with 3 tiny dashes radiating from it. Brandon stared at it, heart pounding. This wasn't a souvenir. It was a record. A memory encoded in the most private way a soldier could preserve it. He smoothed the map out beside the jacket and took a photo with his phone. Then, feeling almost guilty, he reached again into the coat's inner pocket and found something else. A matchbook. On its inside flap, someone had scribbled in small, tight handwriting, "If you're reading this, you've either earned it, or you've gone too far." Either way, remember, silence wasn't just protocol. It was protection. Brandon sat back in his chair, stunned. He looked at the jacket again, now fully unfolded on the table. The lining had been reinforced with a second layer of material, darker, smoother, almost waterproof. It was custom work, not military issue. As if someone had anticipated carrying something through hell and needing to make sure it came out the other side. He stared at the map for a long time. Something in the back of his mind tugged, a memory from the microfilm in the library. He pulled up the photo of the article on his phone and scanned the paragraph. Operatives deployed under blackout parameters. Coordinates withheld by military sensors. Rescue occurred in dense terrain east of Quang Nam Province. Brandon opened a search tab and entered what he could decipher from the oilcloth map. After cross-referencing old Vietnam-era field reports and terrain models, he found it. The red dot sat squarely in what had once been a region labeled, No Fire Zone Echo, a place few units entered, and even fewer returned from. He leaned back in his chair, the significance pressing down on him like a wave. Siobhan hadn't just been a soldier. He had been part of something off the books, beyond the reach of medals or ceremonies. This map wasn't just a relic. It was a breadcrumb left not for glory, but for accountability. And Siobhan had stitched it into his coat like a final act of witness. Brandon folded the map carefully and placed it in a protective sleeve. He stared at the jacket one more time, then stood and walked over to his bookshelf. He pulled down a blank journal, the kind he'd bought a year ago and never found the courage to start. Opening to the first page, he began to write. Chevan's coat isn't just worn. It's armored. Armored in silence, in memory, in purpose. The triangle isn't just a symbol. It's a wound, one stitched shut not to hide the pain but to carry it. The map hidden inside isn't about where he went. It's about what he wouldn't let be forgotten. He stopped writing and looked up, breathing heavily. There was a tightness in his chest that felt like urgency. Like a call. He picked up his phone and texted Tina. Need to meet. Park. Now. Bring your gloves. 20 minutes later, they met at the bench beneath the oak tree. Brandon handed her a copy of the map, already laminated. Tina studied it with narrowed eyes. This is real? She asked. Brandon nodded. I found it stitched into the lining. And this, he passed her the matchbook, was tucked inside. Tina turned it over, reading the note inside. Her expression changed. So why now? Why show us this? Brandon shook his head. I don't think it was meant to be found yet. But I think he's ready. Or he's leaving it behind for when he no longer can tell the story himself. She looked up. So what do we do? Brandon exhaled. We find out what this story means. We protect it. We don't let it become just another war story passed around until it's polished into fiction. Tina folded the map and handed it back. Then we better start asking the right people. Because if Siobhan stitched this into a coat and wore it for 50 years, it means someone, somewhere, would still rather it never be unstitched. Brandon nodded. But it's out now. And we're the ones holding the thread. He looked back toward the center of the park, where the wind was lifting the fallen leaves into small spirals. For the first time, he understood that memory wasn't something you looked at. It was something you carried forward. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The next day, Brandon returned to the library with the map folded tightly inside a manila envelope. The moment he stepped inside, the scent of dust and lemon oil greeted him like a breath from the past. Maggie was at the reference desk, flipping through an old volume of the town's Historical Society minutes. She looked up as he approached, eyes narrowing slightly. You've got that face again, she said. Like a man who just found a door and isn't sure if he wants to open it. Brandon laid the envelope on the desk. I found this inside Chevan's coat. Hidden between the lining. It's a map. It matches blackout coordinates from the Southeast Asia drop. There's more. He handed her the matchbook and pointed to the handwriting inside. It's a warning. Or maybe a reminder. Either way, it was meant to stay hidden unless someone like him thought the time was right. Maggie read the message, lips pressed together. If you're reading this, you've either earned it, or gone too far. She closed the matchbook with care. He's not a man who does anything by accident. If he left that, it's because someone needed to see it. She tapped her pen twice on the desk. Give me a minute. She disappeared behind a row of shelves and returned with a brown folder bound by a silk tie. It looked older than most of the books on display, its label faded to illegibility. Maggie untied it, revealing a stack of photocopied letters, newsprint, and personal correspondence. This was left with us in '92, she said. No return address. No explanation. Just a note, for the record, not for the ceremony. I kept it off the system. Never felt right cataloging something meant to stay quiet. Brandon sifted through the pages. There were old memos stamped confidential, photocopies of photographs with names scratched out, and one letter, handwritten in blocky script, dated November 1976. It was addressed to someone named Colonel J.P. Torrance. He froze. Torrance, he said. As in General Elaine Torrance? Maggie nodded. Her father. She grew up here. He died in the late '80s. She left town after graduation, went straight into the academy. Brandon carefully lifted the letter from its plastic sleeve. It was from someone who identified himself only as H. The content was brief but powerful. Sir. They said medals would follow. I said no. Told them this wasn't something for display. Told them a stripe didn't weigh as much as memory. They asked what I wanted. I said nothing. They asked if I'd take a citation. I said I already had what I needed. The names. The silence. The right to keep showing up in places they no longer could. That's all the medal I ever wanted. H. Brandon held the paper gently, feeling the weight of every sentence. It was him, he said. This was Siobhan. He wrote to Torrance's father. Told him he didn't want a medal. Didn't want recognition. Just to be left with his duty and his dead. Maggie reached out, laying a hand on the edge of the folder. You ever wonder what kind of man turns down a medal from the Pentagon? Not out of bitterness. But because he's already carrying more than they could pin on him. Brandon looked down at the faded triangle patch, now clearer in his memory than it had ever been in person. He didn't need a medal. The jacket was the medal. Every time he wore it, he was reminding himself. Reminding us. They sat in silence for a moment. Maggie tapped the top of the folder. He knew this wouldn't stay buried forever. That one day someone would dig. Maybe he hoped they'd understand before they spoke too loud. Brandon stood slowly, the envelope and folder held like sacred texts. I don't know if I understand it all. But I think I'm ready to listen. Later that afternoon, he returned to the park. Siobhan was already there, brushing off the walkway near the memorial stones. Brandon approached with the manila envelope tucked under one arm and the folder under the other. He stopped a few steps away, letting the silence announce his presence. Siobhan glanced over, then returned to his work. I found your letter, Brandon said quietly. To Torrance's father. Maggie had it. Siobhan paused, then straightened with a soft grunt. I figured she might. I left it there when the wind shifted. Thought someone might come looking one day. He nodded toward the bench. Sit. Brandon obeyed. The older man sat beside him after a moment, his hands resting on his knees. I didn't turn down that medal because I was angry, Siobhan said. I turned it down because it wasn't mine alone. What they tried to pin on me came from men who didn't walk out. I couldn't wear it knowing that. Not when they were gone. Brandon opened the folder and pulled out the letter. You wrote that silence was your right. That it was enough. Siobhan looked at the paper, eyes tracing the lines he'd written decades ago. Silence isn't emptiness, he said. It's what's left when you've already given everything else. It's the sound of a promise kept. Brandon handed him the map. This too? Siobhan nodded. The only thing I couldn't let go of. I carried that so no one else would need to. Not because I thought I was special, but because it's easy to forget what isn't seen. They sat there, dusk beginning to fall, the amber light casting long shadows across the grass. Siobhan finally turned to Brandon. So. What will you do now that you've seen it? Brandon looked down at the folder, then out toward the memorial stones. I'll remember it right. Not loud. Not polished. But true. I'll tell it the way it lived. Siobhan smiled faintly. Then maybe you're ready to carry the rest. He reached into his coat and pulled out the notebook, the one filled with letters never sent. He placed it on the bench between them. You'll know what to do, he said. And just like that, Siobhan stood, adjusted the triangle patch over his heart, and walked back toward the rows of names that had waited half a century for someone to speak them without applause. The notebook sat on Brandon's desk like a living thing. Its leather cover, worn and slightly cracked at the edges, held a quiet authority that made him hesitate before opening it. He had received it only yesterday, handed off without ceremony by Siobhan, but the weight of it had already changed something in him. This wasn't a gift. It was a trust, and he wasn't about to take it lightly. He took a breath and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was steady, all caps, no flair or flourish, just clear, deliberate ink laid down by someone who didn't waste space or emotion. The entries were not dated but organized by names. Each name came with a memory, a moment, a single truth held up like a match in a dark room. Some entries were barely longer than a sentence. Others stretched into paragraphs. But all of them were written as if the person they described might read it one day. Like a letter from the living to the almost forgotten. Brandon flipped through slowly until he stopped at a name that snagged on something familiar in the back of his mind, Private First Class or Winslow. The passage was longer than most, and he started reading aloud under his breath. Called him Quiet Eyes. Never said more than he needed. Carried 2 extra canteens for the rest of us. Shared one the night before the drop with a kid who couldn't stop shaking. Never once asked for thanks. Never once asked for cover when things went sideways. He just moved. Like he was born between gunfire. We lost him in the last 500 yards. Never heard the shot. Just turned and he was gone. Brandon sat back, stunned. It was the same Winslow, the soldier whose grave young Lena had visited, whose brother had become the reporter that chronicled the rescue without naming the rescuer. The story folded tighter now. Connections that had felt anecdotal were becoming deliberate. The threads Siobhan had quietly held all these years were starting to pull together into a fabric Brandon had never seen before. He stood up and walked to the bookshelf, pulling out the binder of microfilm snapshots Maggie had helped him assemble. He found the article, the one from 1972, with the grainy photo of the 4 rescued soldiers. He had looked at it a dozen times, always focusing on the silhouetted man in the background, the one no one could name. But now, he studied the faces in the foreground. The second man from the left, bandaged shoulder, distant stare, was unmistakable. Brandon compared it to the photo Lena had shown him of her great-uncle. The resemblance was clear. He wasn't just one of the wounded. He was one of the reasons Siobhan had gone back into the fire. Brandon felt a chill run down his spine. That moment, when Siobhan turned around instead of escaping, wasn't an act of heroism born of instinct. It was a promise. To men like Winslow. To people who had become more than comrades. To ghosts that walked beside him, even now. He needed to see Lena again. The school was just letting out when he arrived. Kids poured down the steps in packs, their backpacks bouncing and voices rising into the late afternoon air. Brandon spotted Lena sitting under the flagpole, reading a dog-eared paperback. She looked up and smiled as he approached. "You came back," she said. "You said you would." Brandon smiled. "I wanted to show you something." He handed her a photocopy of the notebook page with her great-uncle's name. She read it quietly, lips moving over the words. When she finished, she looked up with wide eyes. "He remembered him," she whispered. "All that time." He remembered. Brandon nodded. Siobhan wrote about him like he wrote about everyone he couldn't forget. Like remembering was his way of keeping them alive. Lena folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her book. Mom always said Uncle Robert didn't have a grave with medals or flags. Just a stone. But now it feels like he's got something more. Brandon sat beside her. He does. He has a story. One that was carried by someone who never stopped walking beside him. And now, you're carrying it too. Lena looked thoughtful for a moment. "Do you think it's okay if I make a copy and hang it up in my room?" she asked. "I want to remember him the way Siobhan did." Brandon smiled. "I think Siobhan would be honored." That night, Brandon sat on his living room floor with the notebook open, maps spread around him, and files from the library fanned out like a mosaic. The more he read, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a journal. It was a hidden archive of honor, pain, and duty. It wasn't just about Chevan's past. It was about a part of American history that had slipped through the cracks. Not erased maliciously, but neglected because it didn't come with photo ops or easy endings. He turned to the last page of the notebook and saw something new. A list. 5 names. Each accompanied by a symbol, a dot, a dash, a triangle, a star, and a line. The only one with all 5 marks next to it was Chevan's. He didn't understand what the symbols meant yet, but he knew what the names were. They were the members of the triangle team. And Siobhan was the last. Brandon closed the notebook and stared into the quiet. The question wasn't whether the story mattered. It was whether he had the courage to finish what Siobhan had begun. The story had settled into Brandon's bones like smoke after a long burn. He couldn't walk through town anymore without seeing the invisible threads Siobhan had left behind. The benches, the plaques, the flags, everything was part of a larger mosaic that most people passed by without a second glance. But now, Brandon was starting to see it the way Siobhan had always seen it. Not as remnants of history, but as reminders of unfinished promises. That Friday evening, Brandon found himself knocking on a door he'd passed dozens of times but never dared approach until now. The porch was crooked, the mailbox rusted, and the wind pushed dry leaves up against the screen like whispers trying to get in. After a long pause, the door creaked open and Thomas, the neighbor who had pointed him to the cemetery weeks ago, appeared with his cane in hand and a wary look behind his glasses. "Chevan's not here," Thomas said before Brandon could speak. "He left before sunset. Said he had something to do." Brandon hesitated. "Do you know where he went?" Thomas tilted his head. "You ever hear of Ridgepoint Bluff? Out past the highway, near the old fire tower. He drives up there sometimes. Alone. Never said why." Brandon thanked him and got back into his car. The road to Ridgepoint was long and unlit, winding through dense pines and overgrown fields. As he drove, he thought about the entries in the notebook, about Lena's drawing folded on her nightstand, and about the single matchbook with its coded warning. What could Siobhan be doing out here, in the dark, in a place only ghosts remembered? When Brandon reached the end of the gravel road, he saw Chevan's truck parked near the edge of the overlook. No lights. No sound. Just the creaking of trees in the breeze and the distant chirr of insects hidden in the brush. Brandon climbed out and stepped quietly toward the clearing. He stopped short when he saw the flames. A small campfire burned low, more ember than blaze, and Siobhan sat in front of it on a folding stool. He wore the jacket again, the triangle patch illuminated by the soft orange glow. He didn't turn as Brandon approached, but he spoke, voice low and even. "Didn't think you'd find this place." Brandon stood still for a moment. "Thomas told me. I needed to see where you go when you're not guarding headstones." Siobhan stirred the fire with a stick. "This is where I left it." Brandon moved closer. "Left what?" Siobhan's eyes reflected the fire as he finally looked up. "The night I came out of the jungle with those two men. This is where they flew us. Ridgepoint Airfield, back when it still operated under the black flag. It's gone now, but the hill remembers." Brandon sat on a fallen log, the heat from the fire brushing his face. "Why tonight?" "Anniversary," Siobhan said. 50 years ago today. November 17th. It was supposed to be a clean-up recon only. Drop in, take photos, extract. But the LZ was compromised. Pilot didn't even make it to the ground. Took fire in the tail and nosed into the trees. The blast lit up the night. Brandon listened, heart tightening. He didn't dare interrupt. "We were scattered," Siobhan continued. 6 men. I found 2. The others were dead or pinned. One had a broken spine. The other had shrapnel in his leg. No medevac. No comms. Just a triangle drawn in the dirt and a prayer." He stared into the flames, eyes unfocused. "I carried the smaller one on my back and dragged the other with a rope. 3 miles. Through mud and bullets and smoke so thick it felt like the end of the world. I don't remember the pain. I remember the silence. I remember the heat of their blood. I remember the voice of the younger one, the one with the spine injury, saying, 'Don't stop walking,' over and over. He died 30 feet from the evac site. I laid him down and never moved him again." Brandon closed his eyes, overwhelmed. "I didn't talk about it," Siobhan said. "Didn't want to. Didn't need to. But every year, on this night, I come here. I sit in front of this fire and I listen." Brandon looked at him. "To what?" "To the sound of everything that didn't get said." A long pause passed between them. Brandon reached into his jacket and pulled out the list from the notebook. "The 5 names. The symbols. I don't know what these marks mean," he said quietly. Siobhan nodded, then pointed to the triangle. "That was me. The others, different skill sets. Different specialties. One was a codebreaker. Another a demolitions expert. We never wore dog tags. Just these. Drawn in chalk on our boots before a drop. If you saw someone fall, you'd check their symbol. That's how we knew who we'd lost." Brandon traced the symbols with his finger. "Only one triangle. You." "I was the last," Siobhan said. "By the end of the war, the others were gone. Some in battle. Some in ways I can't explain. The kind of missions that never reach paper." Brandon looked around at the trees, at the dark canopy overhead. "So this place is your ground zero?" Siobhan nodded. "Where I ended. Where I began again." The fire popped softly, sending a spray of sparks into the air. "I want to help you tell it," Brandon said. "But only if you're ready." Siobhan looked at him for a long time, the glow flickering across his weathered face. "I don't need my name carved into stone," he said. "But if there's a way to make sure the ones who never made it home aren't just forgotten, then maybe the story's not about me." Brandon understood. It was never about Siobhan. It was about the weight he'd carried, the fire he'd walked through, the silence he had maintained so others could live in peace. He stood and picked up a stick, feeding the fire again. Siobhan didn't speak, and neither did he. They just sat there, 2 men at the edge of the world, bearing witness to the kind of night that could only be remembered through flame and breath. And the fire burned on, long after the past stopped needing permission to be heard. The letter arrived in a plain white envelope with no return address. It sat atop Brandon's city-issued mail pile like it didn't belong there, quietly separate from budget reports and permit requests. The paper was thick, the kind used for formal correspondence, but there was no seal, no emblem, no header. Just his name typed in block letters and a single word underneath. Confidential. Brandon brought it back to his office and closed the door. The envelope opened with a whisper, and inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly into thirds. As he unfolded it, the scent of ink and age rose like a distant memory. The letter was handwritten in elegant, slightly slanted cursive. Mr. Hale. We've never met formally, but I watched you from the podium. I saw the way you looked at him. And I saw the way you didn't look away when the rest of the town still hadn't figured out what was unfolding before their eyes. That moment, the salute, was not just for Siobhan. It was for everyone who was trained to vanish. To move in silence. To carry the weight others couldn't name. Most of them are gone now. But not him. He endured. He carried more than operations and codenames. He carried people. He carried memory. And he carried it so that none of us would be forced to look too closely at what war really takes. My father was his superior officer for a time. He called Siobhan the compass. Not because he gave directions, but because he always pointed north, even when the map was burning. You've been trusted with something few civilians are ever allowed to hold, truth without polish. Honor without fanfare. History that refuses to wear a uniform. If you're going to carry it forward, then carry it fully. I've enclosed a transcript. Use it how you see fit. Elaine Torrance. Ret. General, United States Army. Brandon sat back in his chair, staring at the signature. The writing was unmistakably hers. Firm. Disciplined. A general's pen. Attached to the letter was a second document, a typed transcript with timestamps, clipped from what appeared to be a private debriefing, redacted only slightly. Across the top, it read. Operation Nightfall / Subject Debrief, Mercer, H / Classification Level, Code Black. Brandon's breath caught. Mercer. Siobhan's last name. It had been whispered once or twice, but now it was printed with official finality. The file was structured in military formality, questions, answers, time markers. But what struck him was the clarity in Siobhan's voice. Even through text, it rang like gravel dragged across truth. Question operative, please confirm. You re-entered the hot zone after initial evac was compromised. A. Confirmed. Question why? Orders were not to return. A. Orders weren't there when he screamed my name. Brandon read each line slowly, his pulse rising. Question: were you aware the two soldiers were listed as unrecoverable? A. I don't care what they were listed as. I saw them breathing. That's enough. Question: you carried them across 3.2 miles of hostile terrain. A. Measured it by their pain, not the distance. There was a pause in the transcript, a note from the recording officer. Subject paused. No verbal response for 43 seconds. Recorded visible shaking of hands. The next answer was shorter. A. You want to know if I regret going back. I regret not being able to carry more. Brandon put the pages down. His throat was dry. He stared at the wall of his office, at the shadow of a framed city certificate, and wondered how much of the world was built on the silence of men like Siobhan, men who never made demands, never asked to be seen, but whose actions had moved mountains. He folded the letter and the transcript carefully and locked them in the top drawer of his desk. Then he reached for his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used since the ceremony. The line clicked after 2 rings. Siobhan, Brandon said quietly, I got a letter from General Torrance. A pause. I figured you would, Siobhan said. She's one of the few who still knows how to close a door before speaking. Brandon leaned forward. She said you were the compass. Siobhan chuckled once. She gave me that name during a mission where everything went sideways. Said when the bullets start flying and the ground doesn't match the map, you need someone who doesn't panic. Brandon nodded slowly. She also said you carried more than operations. That you carried memory. Another silence. She's not wrong, Siobhan said. Memory is heavier than equipment. Heavier than guilt. It never gets lighter, just more familiar. Brandon took a breath. I want to do this right. I don't want to turn your story into some polished documentary or viral post. I want people to understand what service means when there's no one clapping at the end. Siobhan was quiet for a long time. Then stop thinking about the story like it's mine, he said. It's not. It's theirs. The men who didn't come back. The ones whose names aren't on plaques because the operation didn't officially exist. If you tell it for them. Brandon felt a lump forming in his throat. I will. Siobhan sighed. There's one more file. Last one. It's buried. But you'll find it in the box I left with Maggie. Top shelf, back wall. The label's a lie. It always was. Brandon stood. You knew I'd come looking, didn't you? I didn't know, Siobhan said. But I hoped. That evening, Brandon returned to the library. Maggie was waiting. You're here for the red file, aren't you? She asked before he said a word. He smiled. Yeah. The one with the fake label. Maggie stood and walked toward the back wall. He left it 20 years ago. Told me to keep it in plain sight because no one ever checks what's right in front of them. She pulled down a red folder labeled Garden Club Minutes, 1985. Inside was not gardening notes, but black and white photos, field maps, and one final report marked deceased, unconfirmed. Brandon's hands trembled. The last piece of the past was waiting. And tomorrow, it would have a voice. The Millage High School auditorium hadn't changed in years. The stage still creaked in the same places. The faded maroon curtain still held the scent of old varnish and chalk dust. Rows of plastic chairs were arranged with rigid symmetry, every fourth seat marked with a masking tape X, remnants from a distant fire drill protocol. The room hummed with the restless energy of teenagers trying to appear disinterested while secretly watching everything. Brandon stood off stage, holding a folded letter and watching the audience fill in. Parents with phones clutched in their laps. Teachers in department polos. Kids in hoodies, backpacks sagging at their feet. He exhaled slowly. Siobhan stood behind him, dressed in a charcoal gray sweater and slacks. No jacket. No patch. No name tag. Just presence. His eyes scanned the rows with quiet alertness, not assessing threat, but absorbing something more subtle, a room full of youth who hadn't yet been asked to carry weight. Brandon turned to him. You sure about this? Siobhan nodded. One condition. Brandon smiled faintly. No applause. Siobhan adjusted his sleeves and stepped toward the light. Brandon took a step back, watching the old man ascend the short stairs to the mic. The buzz of idle chatter dimmed as soon as he reached center stage. He adjusted the mic slightly, then stood there, letting the silence stretch. He didn't speak right away. He looked at the students, one by one, pausing long enough for them to shift in their seats, unsure of what to expect. Then he spoke. I was asked to talk about service, he began. His voice was calm and clear, not loud but deeply present. Most of what you think service looks like is what you've seen in movies. Speeches. Flags. Ceremonies. But most service doesn't come with any of that. The room stilled. Sometimes, service is just showing up. Every day. Without anyone asking. Without expecting thanks. Just because it's right. Sometimes, it's carrying someone 3 miles through jungle while everything around you burns. Sometimes, it's wiping down a bench with no name on it. Sometimes, it's being quiet when everyone else is shouting. The silence in the room had changed. It wasn't from politeness anymore. It was reverence. When I was 19, Siobhan continued, I carried a man who had been shot. He couldn't walk. He kept telling me not to stop. Over and over. His voice was louder than the fear. Louder than the pain in my shoulders. I didn't stop. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't wait for backup. I just kept walking. He paused, letting the words breathe. You're going to hear a lot of voices in your life. Some will tell you to chase titles. Some will tell you to be louder. Some will tell you to be visible. But sometimes, the only voice you need to hear is the one asking you to keep going. Even when no one is watching. Brandon watched from the wings, his throat tight. He held the folded letter from General Torrance in his hand, but he knew now he wouldn't need it. Siobhan was saying everything that mattered. You'll be told to speak up, Siobhan said. And sometimes, you should. But other times, you'll need to shut up and carry. And that doesn't make you less brave. It makes you necessary. From the back of the room, a teacher wiped her eyes quietly. A boy in an ROTC uniform sat straighter. Another student, lanky and bespectacled, opened his notebook and started scribbling furiously. Siobhan looked out at the crowd one last time. Service isn't about being remembered. It's about remembering what matters. And living like it does. He stepped back from the mic, true to the agreement. No one clapped. But no one moved either. The stillness held as Brandon walked to the center and unfolded the letter. This, he said, was written by a general who once served with the man you just heard from. She wrote, and I quote, "The best heroes don't speak loudly. They listen. They notice what's needed and do it without asking for credit." Siobhan reminds us what service truly means. He looked down for a moment, then back at the room. No applause, he said, echoing the rule. But if what he said meant something to you, carry it with you. Not just today. Not just until the end of this week. But when someone around you needs help. When the weight of something unfair lands in your lap. When nobody else steps forward. He looked toward Siobhan, who stood now with his hands folded behind him, as still as a statue carved out of time. Because the world doesn't change through applause, Brandon finished. It changes through action. There was no bell to signal the end. No ushering of bodies. Just a slow rise, like the swell of morning light. One student stood first, then another. Conversation started low, and then the room filled with the soft sound of movement. The teacher who'd been crying led her students out in single file. The ROTC cadet lingered at the back, eyes locked on Siobhan like a compass finding north. The lanky student raised his hand as the crowd thinned. Sir, he asked, what did the patch mean? The one on the jacket? Siobhan looked at him for a long moment. It meant I went where others wouldn't, he said. The boy nodded once and didn't ask anything else. Later, after the room had emptied, Siobhan stood alone on the stage. Brandon joined him, the echo of the students still fading from the walls. You did more than speak, Brandon said quietly. Siobhan didn't answer right away. He looked at the chairs, now empty, and the spotlight dimmed overhead. I planted something, he said. We'll see if it grows. Brandon nodded. I think it already has. They walked out side by side, the hallway quiet, their footsteps the only sound. And behind them, the echoes of a truth long carried in silence finally began to speak. The auditorium had emptied, but the words lingered. Even after the chairs were stacked and the lights dimmed, there was something in the air that wouldn't leave. Brandon could feel it in his chest, like a soft current pressing inward, as if the room itself had absorbed Cheven's presence and didn't want to let it go. Outside, the early evening was settling in. A few students lingered in the parking lot, their voices quiet, their laughter subdued. Normally career day ended with giggles and eye rolls. This year, it ended with silence and glances that lingered longer than usual. Brandon waited near the flagpole as Siobhan stood at the edge of the steps, gazing across the school lawn like he was looking at something older than buildings and bricks. He held nothing in his hands. No bag, no folder, no evidence of what he'd just done. But he stood like someone who'd left something behind, not something physical, but something invisible and lasting. A small voice interrupted them. "Excuse me, sir." They both turned. A boy, maybe 12, stood a few feet away. His hands were jammed in the pockets of an oversized hoodie, and his backpack drooped off one shoulder. His eyes were wide, curious but not afraid. Siobhan gave him a nod. "Yes, son." The boy hesitated, like the words were heavy in his throat. "I just wanted to ask, how did you know when to go back? I mean, when you were scared. How did you decide?" Brandon waited for the answer, just as curious as the boy. It was the kind of question you didn't usually get from someone that age. But somehow, tonight had pulled something deeper from everyone. Siobhan studied the boy for a moment, then spoke with a voice low and deliberate. "You don't decide based on fear," he said. "Fear's always there. But sometimes, you hear someone calling your name, and you realize they're expecting you to show up. Not someone else. Not later. Right then." The boy's brow furrowed. "But what if you're not ready?" Siobhan smiled faintly. "You won't be. That's the truth. You won't be ready. You'll be tired, and confused, and angry, and you'll think someone else is more qualified. But the world doesn't wait for perfect. It waits for someone willing." The boy nodded slowly. "My dad said heroes always have a plan." Siobhan chuckled gently. "Your dad's not wrong. Plans are good. But sometimes, all you've got is your gut and the weight of what's right. That's enough if you let it be." The boy shifted his backpack, then looked up again. "So, were you scared?" Siobhan didn't hesitate. "Every time. But I didn't let it be the only voice I listened to." The boy blinked like he hadn't expected that kind of honesty. Most adults would have said no, or given some answer wrapped in bravado. But not Siobhan. His answer made room for reality. Brandon stepped forward. "What's your name?" he asked the boy. "Marcus," he said quietly. "Well, Marcus," Brandon said, "you asked the kind of question most people don't ask until they're much older." Marcus nodded. "I just wanted to understand." Siobhan knelt slowly so his eyes were level with the boy's. "Understanding will come. Just keep asking questions like that one. And when the day comes that someone calls your name, don't look around for who else might answer. Just step forward." Marcus looked like he wanted to say more, but instead he gave a quick nod and turned, disappearing down the path toward the row of buses lined up like sleeping metal giants. Brandon and Siobhan stood in silence again. "She's going to remember that," Brandon said. "He will," Siobhan replied. "You don't forget the first time someone doesn't lie to you." They walked across the lot, passing by the stone plaque near the flagpole that bore the school's motto. Brandon had seen it 100 times, but now the word seemed clearer than ever. Fortitude. Duty. Truth. Brandon read it aloud. "That you?" Siobhan shook his head. "That's them. I just lived by it." Later that night, Brandon sat at his desk, reviewing notes he didn't realize he had written. His pages were filled with fragments. Phrases Siobhan had spoken. Words students had whispered. The sentence from the general's letter echoed through everything. "You've been trusted with truth without polish. He picked up his pen and started writing. Marcus asked the question that matters most. How do you know when to step forward? The answer isn't about courage. It's about recognition. Recognizing that silence can be heavier than fear, and that doing nothing is a decision too. He stopped, took a breath, and looked at the corner of the desk where the jacket sat folded again, the patch still facing up. It wasn't a decoration. It was a reminder. The phone buzzed. A text from Lena. I printed the note Siobhan wrote about my uncle. My mom cried. I think she's going to start coming to the memorials. Brandon replied simply. He'd be honored. Then he opened the notebook again and turned to the next blank page. He titled it The Question of a Boy and began writing. Because now, there were more questions. And it was time the world started answering them the way Siobhan had. Not with speeches. But with presence. The sun rose slow and pale over Millage the morning the jacket went on display. The library staff arrived early, long before the usual weekday rhythm of coffee cups and open books. Maggie had insisted on curating the case herself, and no one questioned it. The north display, typically used for rotating historical exhibits and town photographs, had been cleared. The glass was polished to a quiet shine. The light above it had been adjusted to the perfect angle. And there, centered with deliberate care, was Siobhan's jacket. It wasn't draped or hung like some costume from a museum. It was folded, neatly and simply, just as it had rested so many mornings on the corner booth at Maple and Pine. The triangle patch faced outward now, lit softly by a warm bulb that made the faded blue look almost silver. Time had worn the fabric thin, but the threads were still intact. Around the jacket, there was no clutter. No plaque listing awards. No dates. Just a small brass plate affixed to the glass with 3 quiet words etched into it. He reminded us. By 10 o'clock, people had begun trickling in. First, the regulars, teachers on break, retirees with thermoses, a few high school students who had lingered after career day with new thoughts in their heads. Then came the others. People who hadn't set foot in the library in years. A mail carrier in uniform. A mother holding the hand of her son. A teenager with earbuds, who took them out without being told. They gathered around the display without ceremony, moving slow, speaking even slower. No one pointed. No one posed for photos. They just looked. Brandon watched from the corner near the circulation desk, his arms crossed, the same feeling in his chest he had experienced the day of the salute. A kind of stillness that didn't belong to silence but to reverence. It was the kind of quiet that let people feel instead of perform. Norman Jr. was the first to break from the crowd. The boy approached the glass carefully, his small fingers pressed to the railing. He wore a denim jacket that day, the collar upturned against the autumn chill, and 2 American flag pins fastened near the buttons. He leaned in close to the case, eyes locked on the patch. Then he pulled something from his pocket, a tiny folded napkin, and placed it gently on the base of the display before stepping back. Brandon recognized it immediately. One of the spare napkins from the diner. The kind Siobhan used every morning to hold his receipt. Maggie came and stood beside Brandon without a word. She held a leather notebook in one hand, the same one Siobhan had given to Brandon weeks ago. It was now part of the collection, though its contents had been transcribed and preserved digitally for safekeeping. You did this, she said quietly. Brandon shook his head. He did. We just made space for the rest of the town to see it. Maggie nodded. Sometimes, that's all history needs. A little light and someone willing to carry the box. Brandon looked toward the case again. A young girl with braids pointed toward the patch and asked her grandmother something. The older woman smiled and whispered back, and the girl nodded as if she understood something far older than she could name. The day passed like a slow tide. The visitors came in waves. Tina Alvarez showed up just before noon, still in her work gear, boots muddy from the cemetery path. She didn't say anything. She just stood with her arms crossed, staring at the jacket like it was a flag she recognized in a language no one else spoke. At some point, Brandon lost track of time. He only noticed when the light above the case dimmed automatically, the sun beginning to lower outside the high windows. The crowd had thinned, but not dispersed. Some people returned more than once. Others lingered with the kind of posture you see in churches and gravesites. There was no list to sign. No guest book. But every person who stood in front of the glass seemed to leave something behind that wasn't visible. By early evening, Lena arrived with her mother. The girl held a framed printout of the passage Siobhan had written about her great-uncle, Winslow. Her mother carried a flower, a single white bloom, and together, they placed both items gently at the side of the display, out of the way, but close enough to be part of the moment. The mother's eyes were wet, her hand resting on Lena's shoulder. Brandon approached after they had stepped back. He remembered him, he said softly. Lena nodded. And now we will too. She looked up at him. Does this mean other people will know about the others too? The ones whose names aren't written anywhere? Brandon took a breath. Yes. Because remembering one means remembering all. And this jacket doesn't just hold his story. It holds theirs too. Lena smiled, small but steady. I think that's what he wanted. Before leaving, she knelt and adjusted the napkin Norman had placed, smoothing the edge with care. That night, as the library lights dimmed and the front doors locked, Brandon returned for one last look. He stood alone in front of the case, the room now silent in a way that felt earned. He thought about the phrase on the plaque. It didn't say what he reminded us of. It didn't need to. Some things live better between the lines. Brandon placed his hand gently on the glass. Then he whispered, not because Siobhan was listening, but because the town finally was. We see you now. And outside, in the growing dark, the wind stirred gently through the trees, lifting fallen leaves like memories too light to stay buried. Sunday morning came wrapped in mist. The sky was a soft gray canvas, and the trees in Hillrest Cemetery stood like silent sentinels, their limbs bare but watchful. Brandon parked his car at the edge of the gravel path just before 7. He didn't bring flowers this time. He didn't carry notes or cameras or any of the things people usually thought to bring to a memorial. He brought only himself, which he was beginning to understand was enough. As he walked along the familiar path, he noticed he wasn't alone. There were others already there, scattered across the veterans section like quiet markers in motion. Tina stood by the far bench, arms folded, her maintenance uniform dusted with earth. Maggie had arrived earlier, bundled in a wool coat, her glasses fogging with every exhale. Lena was there too, standing next to her mother, holding a small folded triangle of white paper. But at the center of it all, near bench 7 and the stone of Lieutenant Callahan, stood Siobhan. He wasn't kneeling. He wasn't brushing leaves. He wasn't even holding his cane. He stood upright, hands clasped in front of him, eyes on the horizon like he was waiting for a formation that only he could see. Brandon moved toward him slowly, nodding to the others as he passed. By the time he reached Chevin's side, the small crowd had quietly begun forming a circle around them. No one spoke. No one was led. They simply moved, guided by something invisible and shared. The kind of movement that came from hearts aligned more than heads directed. Siobhan turned slightly and gave Brandon a single nod. There was no surprise in his eyes, no need for questions. He simply said, "You brought them." Brandon glanced around the circle forming. They brought themselves. A long silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was full. Full of breath, and memory, and a kind of unity that didn't need to be declared. The wind moved softly through the grass. A bird called once from a nearby tree. And still, no one spoke. Then Siobhan stepped forward and placed a small object at the base of Callahan's stone. It was a worn compass, the kind with a cracked face and a frayed cord. He set it gently in the grass and stepped back. This was his, he said quietly. He gave it to me before the drop. Said I'd know what direction to go when the time came. I never really did. But I kept it anyway. Brandon could see the glint of the metal in the weak morning light, and he realized it wasn't just a keepsake. It was a promise. One that had traveled through war, silence, and decades of Sundays. Tina stepped forward next. She placed a folded pair of work gloves on the bench. He taught me how to sweep the stones without scraping the name, she said. I didn't think that mattered. Now I do. Maggie followed, her steps slow but deliberate. She laid down an envelope, the edges worn with time. He left stories with me. I didn't know how to carry them at first. But I learned. And now, I'll teach others. Lena, holding her mother's hand, approached last. She placed her folded paper triangle on the stone, then looked up at Siobhan. You made me want to learn more, she said. Not just about him. About all of them. Siobhan looked at her with something that almost reached his lips, a smile, not full but whole. Then you're already doing it right. The group stood together, the offerings placed in silence, the circle now complete. Brandon felt a shift then, not in the air, but in himself. The story was no longer his to carry alone. It had passed into other hands, into other hearts. It had become something alive. After a few minutes, Siobhan took a slow breath and spoke again. There's no speech today. No ceremony. Just this. Us. Being here. That's more than enough. No one responded. They didn't need to. Their presence was the response. Then, something unexpected happened. One by one, the circle began to hum. No melody. No lyrics. Just a low, gentle sound. The kind that comes when voices align without instruction. It wasn't organized. It wasn't rehearsed. But it grew. Like breath shared across generations. Brandon didn't know who started it, but when it passed through him, he joined without hesitation. It wasn't singing. It was remembering. It was what silence sounds like when it finally decides to speak. The hum faded slowly, like smoke lifting from the ground. When it ended, no one applauded. They simply stood in stillness until Siobhan turned back toward the path. Next Sunday, he said, you don't need to wait for me. Then he walked. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just with purpose. As he passed Brandon, he rested a hand briefly on his shoulder. Now you know what it means to carry. Brandon nodded, not trusting his voice. The others began to move too, some lingering at the stones, others stepping away toward the gates. No instructions. No schedule. Just the quiet dignity of people who had learned that sometimes the greatest act of service is simply showing up. As the sun crept higher, casting long shadows across the grass, Brandon stood alone for a moment longer. He looked down at the compass resting beside the stone, the glove, the letter, the triangle of paper. Together, they looked like fragments of a language only the heart could speak. And in that moment, he realized the truth. The circle of Sunday had no end. It only had openings. For those ready to stand. Winter arrived quietly in Millage, as if it knew the town needed time to absorb all that had passed. The days shortened, the air turned sharp, and the park benches collected thin layers of frost that melted slowly under pale morning light. But even as the season changed, one thing remained the same. Each Sunday at 3 o'clock, someone always arrived at Hillrest Cemetery. Sometimes it was Tina with a rake and a fresh flag. Sometimes it was Maggie with a new envelope of memories carefully copied from Shevon's notebook. Occasionally it was Lena, her hands small but determined, folding paper triangles with steady fingers. And often it was Brandon, never leading, never commanding, just standing with those who had learned how to be present. They called it the circle now. Not officially. Not on paper. But among themselves. The word passed in conversation and calendar reminders, whispered in the same way old songs are remembered by those who no longer need sheet music. But on one bitter January morning, everything changed. Brandon arrived at Maple and Pine just after sunrise. The bell above the door chimed the way it always had, but something inside felt different. The corner booth was empty. Not just vacant, but untouched. No coffee cup. No newspaper. No jacket. Just the stillness of absence. Darlene stood behind the counter, her hand frozen mid-reach for the coffee pot. She met Brandon's eyes with a look that said everything before she spoke. "He's gone," she whispered. "Last night." Quiet. In his sleep. The words hit Brandon like a slow wave. Not sudden. Just final. He nodded once, stepped aside, and sat at the booth where the morning sun spilled through the window. The cushion gave slightly beneath him, as though remembering every Sunday Siobhan had ever claimed it. There, folded on the table, was the jacket. The patch faced up, threadbare and luminous in the golden light. Next to it sat a receipt, blank except for a timestamp and the name Siobhan, written in the same steady hand. And tucked underneath, folded neatly in half, was one final napkin. Brandon lifted it with reverence. 5 words. "Don't wait for permission. Walk." He sat back in the booth, letting the words settle. Around him, the diner carried on. Plates clattered softly in the kitchen. The jukebox turned over to an old Sinatra track. But everything moved slower now, as if even the walls knew what had been lost. That afternoon, Brandon walked to the library. Maggie had already heard. She opened the archive room before he asked, unlocking the cabinet that held the red folder, the notebook, the microfilm clippings. But Brandon didn't reach for them. "I need the case," he said softly. Maggie nodded. "It's ready." In the northern corner of the library, beneath the glass case where the jacket had rested for weeks, was now a new arrangement. The compass Siobhan had left by Callahan's grave. The folded triangle from Lena. The gloves from Tina. And in the center, resting on dark velvet, the triangle patch, removed from the jacket with care, its edges still rough but proud. A new plaque had been added below the original. "Some walk without medals. Some carry names instead." Brandon stood for a long time in front of the display. Then he reached into his coat and placed Cheven's final napkin beside the patch. He stepped back as others filtered in. They didn't need to be told. They had already heard. The funeral was held the following Saturday. It wasn't publicized, but word traveled faster than schedules. The chapel at Hillrest filled beyond capacity. Veterans, students, librarians, city workers, and people who had never spoken a word to Siobhan but somehow felt like they knew him. No flowers. No slideshow. No eulogy. Only a chair left empty on the stage, with a folded jacket resting in its center. When the service ended, the procession walked out into the cold, single file, toward the same row of graves Siobhan had tended for decades. The headstone was simple. Name, rank, and 3 lines at the bottom. He carried them. He walked alone. Until we followed. Brandon stood beside it, the wind cutting across his coat, the scent of pine and cold soil sharp in the air. He looked down at the marker, then turned to face the growing group behind him. Tina. Maggie. Lena and her mother. Norman Jr. with his 2 flag pins. Others too. Faces new and familiar, all standing because they had seen what service without spotlight looked like. Brandon took a breath. "This isn't a goodbye," he said. "It's a continuation." He pulled a small box from his coat and opened it. Inside were a dozen cloth patches, hand-stitched, triangles in faded blue. Not replicas. Not souvenirs. Symbols. He handed one to Tina, one to Maggie, one to Lena. Not everyone will understand what this means, he said. But we will. And that's enough. As the sun began to dip low behind the trees, each person walked forward, laying something of their own at the foot of Shevon's grave. A letter. A coin. A drawing. A stone. The circle formed again, this time wider, this time stronger, no longer needing its center to stay whole. Brandon stood until the last person left. Then he stepped forward, laid his own patch at the base of the stone, and brought his hand to his brow in a slow, quiet salute. Not for show. But for thanks. Because now, he understood. The last salute wasn't about the end. It was about carrying the beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?